So my portion will be really talking more about quality assurance, quality control, and maybe getting into a little bit of distortion correction if I have time.
And are the latest slides posted on Canvas, or are these new ones?
Not yet. There's been an update. I just got it, and so I'll post it after.
Okay. So the slides on Canvas are not exactly these slides.
Yeah, I added some stuff. So some of the topics we'll be covering here, like I said, is quality assurance. And kind of going a little bit of examples of a couple programs, tasks, commands that you can use to help quickly look at your data quality. The two that I've looked at the most is the FMRI QA and then the AFNI Proc PY. Is anyone familiar with AFNI and AFNI Proc PY? Anyone used it? Okay, so it's a nice tool. I'll talk about it a little bit. And if I do have time, like I said, I'll start getting into some of the field inhomogeneities and susceptibility and how methods that might be used to help correct for some of that. So most fMRI studies are really based on the bullet signal, right? So that signal is really tiny, and this is a picture taken from a chapter that really kind of shows how small that signal is. I don't know if you can see it very well, but on the left side, you see just basically a scan of an epi image of somebody at rest. And you can barely see because it's in black and white, but there's like a crosshairs fixated at a voxel. And the point of this is to really show, just by eyeballing it, you cannot really see the difference between somebody just sitting there and somebody squeezing their hands in the motor cortex. And then you see that the B minus A is really that subtraction or that contrast, showing like really those voxels are really hard to just spot by the eye, telling you again how small that signal really is. And then they just put the percent signal change there too, just to kind of show you that there is an increase in percent signal change, but it's small. You can't really see it. And on this other panel with the time course, the time series, they kind of just show based off of the time course of the mean signal of a voxel over the 140 time points. You can kind of see where A is, where they're resting, in B, and it's about 4% difference. And so it's really tiny signal. And just to kind of take that message a little bit further, again, we're interested in contrast of our task conditions. And one of the most robust findings you can do in tasks you can do is basically looking at faces versus something else in the fusiform gyrus. There's this area called the fusiform face area. And you can see in this plot, kind of anyway, is that the red line plotted, the response is viewing faces, and the blue is viewing a wrench. And you can see that difference between viewing a wrench and viewing a face is actually pretty small. And so what that again just drives home the point. The bullet signal is small. What we're interested in is even smaller than just the general response. And so things that get in the way of us identifying that can be pretty problematic. And so that's where it comes into noise and quality control. And so quality assurance is really kind of like a general term, really applying to making sure and looking at your data, basically. And so you really want to minimize the noise, both with the scanner and then also things that you can do at the experimenter level. And so some examples of system noise inherent is signal drift. The signal drifts over time and can decrease over time. So that can contaminate your bullet response signal that you're wanting to look at. But also just random fluctuations, scanner instability, even just over time, because that can change over time from day to day, week to week, but also even within a run. But like I said, there's also subject variance. So if you've been part of MRI experiments, you know how problematic movement is, head motion is. There's also physiological sources like heartbeats and breathing that really can mask some of the signals and either make an effect disappear or just mask it entirely. And so just as kind of example of plot of a signal drift, like the magnetic field does have slight drifts in strength over time, and so the intensity will drift across acquisition. and can vary from voxel to voxel, and also voxel to voxel, and then also just in different directions. So it really, again, this is an important source of noise that you want to look at in your data to pay attention to and see if you can correct it as much as possible. And I know a lot of pre-processing packages have ways to deal with it. I know AFNI has like a polar command that can help, or at least change some of that drift. Also, like I mentioned a little bit ago, field inhomogeneity, basically because we know that the epi, it's a long acquisition and readout, and that it's influenced by just different phase shifts and in the magnetic field, and also just in different parts of the tissue. You can kind of see in the image there. There's a little bit of signal loss, kind of where the sinuses are, or air cavities like the eyes, and other parts like the ventricles. Again, there's different methods to address this as well, and maybe I'll come back to that later when we talk about correcting for field distortions. The big one, is head motion, right? And so I just kind of put a couple examples from a paper, just highlighting how much motion a person can move. I don't know if you can see it. Like, this is kind of an example of somebody who is moving quite a bit. You can see the millimeters. Somebody was just kind of over the course of the scan moving in different directions, their head moving in different directions. You can see just that's quite a lot of movement over time, then sudden movement as well. And so this would be a data set that would be challenging to correct for, and can kind of compare to something that was a little better. You can see that the scales are quite different, and this is, I think, it's not too bad. It's doable in some populations, and you might be able to adjust for that a little bit smoother. And like I said, head motion and the effects of head motion on the boulder response is really almost become its own field of research and focus. Lots have been written about it, particularly in resting state. It's one of the biggest sources of issues, and you'll get reviewers asking you how you addressed it, or commenting how the way you address it isn't the best way to address it, and you have to come up with the latest and best technique to try to deal with it. And there's numerous ways to do it. It's just everybody kind of has their own camp, and it's just trying to figure out what's the best practice, and then looking at your data, applying it, and seeing how much it addresses it, and comparing them. And so, again, I say the first rule of quality assurance is to examine your data. So again, you really do, when you, both while you're scanning and also when you get the data set, you really want to look at it. You want to look at the actual images, and so there's different, depending on what package you're used to, FSL, AFNI, SPM, there's ways to view the slices and volumes acquired over time, and you really kind of want to review them to see if there's anything off in the way the data look. And so quality assurance, there's different, some people have written different, I guess, ways to deal with it. Like, for example, the MRI centers typically will measure the stability of the scanners over time. They'll do a lot of phantom scanning to test the signal strength, the drift. That really helps make sure all the equipment is working properly and effectively, and finding ways, if there is sources of like radio frequency noise coming in, and see if they can locate where that's coming from and try to fix that. Because some of those things as experimenters is out of our control in that regard, and so good thing we have the centers that can handle some of that for us. But also, as experimenters, we also have our own things we need to pay attention to. So, right, when we're training, making sure everybody who works with the participant in a scanner is well trained, attending all the safety courses, having the correct supervision, and making sure they're really safe and knowing what they're doing in the scanner, making sure how to deal with subjects in the scanner, particularly forcing, or not forcing, I guess you can't really force somebody to stay still, but sometimes you want to. but making sure that they stay still. They're instructed to stay still. There's, you can add extra padding for their head, make sure it's a little bit more stable yet comfortable. And if they get cold, there's things you can do, like give them blankets or sheets to kind of keep them a little bit warmer and from moving around too much. Then also there is image pre-processing that you can do to reduce at least some sources of the noise and contamination in your data. Like I said, the quality assurance, there was a big multi-site study, including people from here, from San Diego, that were part of this, is really to do a multi-site MRI imaging center to see how we can combine data from different scanners and really create like a large data set that experimenters can draw from. And to have that data set, you really need your scanners working properly, the signal being stable across scanners, and developing new quality assurance practices and guidelines to help make that work. It's really important for that multi-site, but also even for single studies. And so the 2006 paper, they kind of wrote about several different quality assurance metrics that are important to pay attention to. The ones that I pay attention to a lot, or the most really, because from an experimenter level, is really your signal to noise ratio, or your signal to fluctuation noise ratio, your percent fluctuation, how much drift is there, and the mean signal. Those are the ones that, as an experimenter, I pay attention to, but overall, all these are pretty important. They're also, some of them are pretty correlated with each other, so if you're having a lot of drift, your signal is probably going to be poor, so it's going to be anti-correlated. Mean signal, or the signal to noise ratio, or the SFNR, are pretty highly correlated together, so they go hand in hand.
Is there any relationship between, like, let's say your subcortical structure, take the hippocampus, like the smaller the region is there any relationship with the drift of the signal?
I guess I'm not 100% sure. I know there's different tissues that will, in temporal lobe, it can be susceptible to some of these artifacts, and so there might be more drift, but I guess I haven't really looked into it detail. I don't know if anyone else knows. Like smaller volumes, I suppose.
Not signal drift per se, but there are some studies that suggest that physiological noise may affect different brain regions differently.
Yeah, like so if we get into inhomogeneity, or the susceptibility of the field strength, you'll see some signal or spatial distortion in like the orbital frontal cortex, maybe in some of the temporal lobe, and so there you might see some changes in a lot of these metrics, and so again, some of those are important regions, right? And so we want to do the best we can to minimize it and then correct for it if we can. And so there was an R package that was developed to help researchers do quality assurance checks on their data. This one here is really kind of based off of those metrics that the Friedman and Glover paper talked about. It's a really easy R package to use, and you can use it on experimental data too, to just kind of check to see the quality of your data. And I was going to show you how to do that, but here I put this slide just basically the website where you basically the GitHub site where it shows you how to install it, but it's pretty simple to run. Let's see if I can get on here. Will this?
You should be able to just hit escape and it should exit out of the PowerPoint.
I'm not used to this version of the old one.
I'm not sure. Yeah, you may need to be
Be on VPN.
VPN if you're on wireless.
Okay, where's your
So my
VPN?
VPN is right down here.
It's gonna let me. So I'm just going into a data set to kind of show you how you can run that really simply, that R package. So it's an R package, so it'll have to be in R. Is people familiar with R and how to use that and how to install libraries? And yeah, it's pretty straightforward. And that slide shows you how to install it and simply run it. So if you write it this way, it opens up a GUI window where you can just then select your data set. So here's a data set. I'm just going to open up into it. Actually, didn't like that one. Hold on. And so basically it'll read your parameters. So basically this would be like in your header or where it's stored is the basic parameters like the matrix, the number of slices, the resolution, TR, slices like I said. But then here we get into the QA metric. So you can really get a chance to just kind of briefly spot check your signal and look at things like your signal to noise ratio. You can look at your drift, and so you can kind of see this is before any pre-processing done, so you can imagine a lot of this is not the best yet because we haven't applied any corrections for anything. And so the hope is that after a lot of pre-processing, or at least even your standard pre-processing, you can improve some of this, particularly like the signal to noise, and maybe decrease some of the drift. And so I'll see how well that worked on a subject. Let's see, let's try, what one was that? So I'm just going into one of the outputs of AFNI proc pre-Y. This is where I analyze the data set. And so if you're familiar with AFNI proc pre-Y, it creates a subdirectory within your subject folder that outputs all of your pre-processing files. And so what I'm going to do now is look at one of the output time series from after pre-processing to kind of compare whether or not I increase the signal to noise, and then also if I can eliminate some of the other sources of noise. Oh, that's another thing. So that's a good point. So it requires nifty files, and so if you're familiar with AFNI, they don't just automatically, unless you specify to save it in nifty. And so let's see. Well, let me get out. So let's go to a different folder. one that I know I did do that with. So I'm going to run it on, for example, if it lets me get over there. Or it might freeze on me. Yeah, looks like it froze on me. There we go. Or not.
You actually have a couple of it open there, it looks like.
Yeah.
So the one that was frozen might have been the suspended process.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. Well, for the sake of time, I'm going to move on and show you a different one. But basically what I was going to show you is that the FMRI, after pre-process it, you will see, if you did your pre-processing correctly, that you'll see a change in your signal-to-noise ratio, that it actually increases pretty well. You see your drift drop considerably because you use some of that, you gress some of that out. It shows like it's a way to basically check the quality of your data. AFNI Proc PY also has their output as well. So, like I said, there's like this review driver that's outputted, and you have to go into. Let's see. I can find my terminal again. So you can see here, there's outputs the @ss review basic. So that will just output your metrics on screen in your window. And so you can see here, maybe, basically it just reads and outputs all the information that you want to know. So this again is on the pre-process data. So this is not something you can look at during pre-processing, but it will show you the quality of your data after. So in the particular ones that you might be interested in is how much motion there were and how much you had to censor out because of motion, another artifact. And so here it tells you what your motion limit was, the number of TRs above that limit, your average motion per TR, and so on. And then it goes down to, the number of runs, totals, TR censored. You get your TSNR average. So again, it's another way to look at the quality of your data after pre-processing. It can be, they try to make it as convenient as possible in AFNI Proc PY to get all the statistics that you need. And some of this information you might need to report, and so you can just extract that. And some of it you might need to correlate with some of your individual difference measures or even your contrast, or covary for it to ensure that motion or number of TR censored aren't interfering with your effects that you're trying. Again, that tiny difference in bold signal that's occurring, and just making sure that it's not due to noise or interaction with noise. And so, as I mentioned earlier, I don't know if the thing or not, but
Can you check this recording?
I think we may have lost the recording when we went to the turn window.
Can we check that time?
It looks like it's probably,
yeah, here.
maybe.
So it seems to or unless this is timed to this. Is anyone on it?
No, it's not. Yeah, it's not Zoom. It's just QuickTime.
Oh. So, yeah.
So, I mean, it might be recording, but it looks like on the right it's showing a record button, but I don't know
Okay.
if that's PowerPoint or
Okay.
QuickTime, unfortunately.
And so, just to kind of going back to this, the formatting kind of got messed up, but you can see that a lot of these quality control measures are correlated with each other. So as you can imagine, average motion, average censored motion, motion displacement, kind of measuring similar constructs, and so correlated at like 0.87 or higher with each other, 8.86 or higher with each other, suggesting you're getting kind of similar information. Also, you can kind of guess like the number of TRs total or TRs censored are going to correlate with each other as well. And then also you can imagine your signal to noise ratio is going to be anti-correlated with the number of TRs that you removed. So the stronger your signal means less that you remove. Basically, then you have decent or clean data, and that you didn't have to remove a whole lot. And so it's just kind of a good way to just review your data, know your data as you're trying to do your contrast of interest and write that up and hopefully get published and get grants and things like that. So what time is it? 2:30. Okay. I can start going into this a little bit here. So as I mentioned, one of the problems with doing functional imaging is that the epi really provides that quick readout of the signal. And so there leads to a lot of distortion in the signal then because of the long and quick readout. And so this can get worse when you have a tissue that is influenced differently. So kind of what the question was earlier, is there different tissues? Yes, that are influenced by some of these artifacts. And yes, like I mentioned earlier, the cavities and sinuses are prone to some of these inhomogeneity problems. And so you can try to fix some of these using some methods that I will hopefully touch on a little bit. And so you can see that different parts of the brain are, like I said, influenced by that, so that you can see a little bit of a drop there in the more of the orbital cortex, and just different areas. You can also see intensities are different depending on the tissue. And so again, this is something that you will want to try to correct for and adjust for. And there's kind of two ways you can do that. For at least for correcting the field distortion, is what they call field maps or top-ups. So one way to do that is using field maps. I don't know if anyone's been part of scanning and collected field maps as part of that. And so what you try to do is collect some scans that really accounts for some of the phase shifts a little bit, and hopefully you can see where there's differences in the signal, and basically can kind of recreate that and basically find sources of where the signal is dropping out at. So like some of the most common field map sequences requires two images with different echo times, and the change in that echo and that phase from one to the other is really proportional to supposedly proportional to that field inhomogeneity that you're trying to adjust for or correct. And so so there's different packages apply it differently, and so AFNI, it's the one that I'm most comfortable, the software I'm most comfortable with, and the one that I use the most, doesn't really do much for field maps. In fact, they kind of suggest you can use other packages to help deal with it, so that they have. So their warping parameters, basically applying different warps, can help get to their anatomical warps, can help the way they do their warping, and it can recover some of that. And same with ants are. But so most of the time when people use field maps, they're going to use probably an FSL program or an SPM program. And the FSL one is called Fugue. I haven't used it myself, but it's a program basically where you acquire your field map scans, and then you basically merge them into a file, and then you can help correct for that distortion. And I think it was primarily built and utilized on a Siemens scanner, but I think there's been some adjustments here. So this is, I think, a script. Was this created, the UCSD one? Because this is the link to.
That was created here.
Yeah, so the help applied on GE scanners. Because like I said, FSL and the way they built it was primarily using Siemens scanners, and they kind of made the code work with their scanner, and so other people, different labs, different centers had to apply it to their own. And so there is a script available on this link that kind of helps you apply that. And then SBM also has a toolbox. I'm not familiar with SBM, but they're more GUI based than you can use command line, but they're often GUI based. And so again, you kind of have to enter in your different scans that have the different TEs that you implement, and then you enter those files in, and then it will help adjust and try to pick up some of that lost dropout or that dropped out signal in those regions. The other and probably more recent innovation is more of the top-ups. And so this basically is a method of walking through the different K-space directions. And so you collect it at the different directions, and so you can see the different direction of the yellow and red lines going through K-space to read, basically acquire the two different, basically trying to capture the distortion in two different directions. And then you interpolate that. And then I'm pretty sure there's two different methods for using these. One, like I said, you can acquire them separately, then apply them to your collected data, so the two different scans, or acquire the blip up and down images and then merge them together in a single file and then correct it that way. I guess there's pros and cons to these different methods, as always with this, and so some are going to be faster than others, some are going to be more robust to different and alternative sources of noise, like motion, for example. And so you kind of have to apply to your data set with expecting, knowing your data set going into it. Okay, this is the approach I'm going to use, test it out and see if it fixes it or not, and then you might have to tweak it a little bit, and that's kind of the name of the game with this.
In this case, would you just know if it fixed it if it looked like the alignment between the functional and the anatomical was like not warped, like overlaying those
warping, it would show I don't know if that would be the best way, but it should. The warping will be better if you pick up this signal in your epi, and so what I'm trying to see if I have a slide here that really captures the difference. Let's see if this is the one where you can see where you basically like there's like missing brain basically, or there's like a dark spot. Basically, you can recapture some of that. I guess that helps to know if it's working. There's also, depending on your signal, your quality assurance, quality control statistics, you can center it in those regions and seeing what your signal is. I guess I don't know if anyone else has any other ways to know whether or not it worked.
It's complicated because it's not just about applying top up, it's also about what your acquisition was to begin with. And so if you're interested in the medial temporal lobe, you're going to change your acquisition to try and capture it best, potentially sacrificing other regions. And so what you might find is applying the field map improves the reliability of the signal there, but at the expense of other areas.
Okay.
And then the other issue is the intensities are different across different tissues and depending on the scan as well. So you fix the field map, or supposedly fix it. Now you still deal with intensities, and so you can see in this image it's dark at the top of the brain and bright at the bottom of the brain. Well, you're going to have different intensities and signal to noise in these different areas, and so you want to adjust for that too. There's lots of packages for that too. AFNI, I don't know if AFNI is the best tool, but they do have some toolboxes like 3D Unify is really, the default options really basically level out the intensities of the white matter. If you add some sub options to the command, it tries to do the same to other tissue. The main ones that we use primarily have been the ANTS-R commands, which are pretty easy to use as well if you're familiar with R and ANTS-R. FSL fast also works pretty well. So one thing to note about the FSL and SPM, the way they handle this is really through their segmentation. And so instead of specifically, it's basically an option you select while you're doing brain segmentation. They adjust for the intensity differences. I don't know if I put that in there. I didn't. But basically, when you load up fast, for example, in FSL through the GUI, there's going to be an option where you select to fix the bias in the field, and that will help adjust with the intensity. Same with SPM. ANTS kind of uses a different method that basically again identifies a non-parametric algorithm to really try to reduce that, and so it searches for sources of inhomogeneity and identifies it, and then you can apply those parameters to your data set and then almost essentially subtract it out, almost like, okay, it's gone. And so you can kind of see, it's kind of blurry, but you can see the dark intensities versus white, and then you identify where those are located, and then you can apply it to your volumes, and then this is your corrected version of it. And so it looks a little bit more uniform. And then there's just been advancements with it. This is like the N3 version of it, and then they did an N4 version of it, and just basically modified it in smoother algorithms to identify it in more of a non-parametric way, and then same thing. And so basically you can kind of see here where some of that distortion is. I guess you can't see the 3D from that. But basically, yeah, you can see it up here, where they identify the source of the change in intensities, and they are going to apply that to the brain, and then you get a cleaner, more uniform brain out, which is going to be really important for registration, both anatomical and also applying your epi to your anatomy. And this is really important for if you're doing morphometric registration in particular.
What does that mean?
So you know how you can, I don't know if that's going to be covered, the difference between rigid and affine, but basically, yeah, but basically the old way of doing it is basically you find certain landmarks in the brain and you take somebody else's brain and try to like find those same landmarks and fit it in there and squish the brain in like 3 directions, like the XYZ. Well, diaphragmatic kind of really instead stretches it and moves it in multiple different directions in a non-parametric way to fit it. And so you can see, you can guess that if your intensities aren't adjusted for, it's not going to know where white matter versus gray matter is going to be, and so it's really going to mess up your warp. And so a lot of, like I said, some of these like AFNI, in particular, I know because I've used it, they basically use that as part of their warping. They do that unifies command, so that way they can identify those different landmarks across multiple areas of the brain to really, so you can stretch and mold into the right gyri and sulcus. So that's actually about all I had here. There are some articles you can read that follow up on this. I highly encourage it, especially with the quality assurance and quality control. Again, garbage in, garbage out idea. If you don't have good data, you don't adjust for it and fix it, you're not going to have data to analyze and, again, get those papers out and grants. So, so that's it. Any questions that I may be able to answer?
I have one question. For the QA tool,
Mm-hmm.
if you were to put that or use that on like a task-based FMRI data set that has where you expect regular fluctuations, then would metrics like TSNR make sense with that tool, or is it there to like give it knowledge that you expect?
I've never used like a contrast in it before.
Okay, only like resting state.
That would probably, well, I've used basically before regression is when I put it in, just to get a general sense of the signal quality. So before I do a contrast is when I do it. So I haven't tried it, and I guess I don't know how that would impact the question of condition differences. Is that?
I guess I'm just wondering, like for certain metrics like TSNR, I would think that like the expected fluctuation would kind of be baked into like a bad metric, just because there is there's fluctuation.
Based off of because they're doing something.
Yeah.
So there's going to be fluctuations based off of the task itself.
Yeah.
It's possible it's going to influence it, but I guess
That signal's so small though, right?
Yeah.
Because we
Way
just,
bigger.
it's only a few percent.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, 'cause
Whereas
if
somebody's moving around a lot, that'll drop your SNR significantly.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if you see like the mean signal, it's quite large, right? And so if you're looking at, I guess, a task related signal, that's so small that I think you can use those quality metrics knowing, okay, this is the overall mean signal, the signal to noise ratio, and then and then you.
Okay.
So I think it's fine to use with task-based data.
I see. Okay, that makes sense.
I suppose you could do like a temporal one within a particular condition if you were particularly concerned about the reliability of the signal within a certain condition.
Yeah, that's a good point.
After you know,
So for example,
by condition,
Yeah, that's a good point, because one of the tasks that I loaded up, or tried to load up anyway, before it froze on me, was a learning task where they got an air puff to the neck, right? And so some conditions they don't get that, but you can imagine getting an air puff to the neck in the scanner. There's going to be some movement, right? And so I might want to isolate that and see how much that specifically is influencing my signal and other quality metrics. Yeah, so that's a good point, though.
Thank you.
Right.
My turn.
Your turn.
And you thought you were done.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Okay, so I am going to switch gears a little bit and talk to you about data organization. So we're kind of taking a step back now. And the reason for this, if you've ever gone into a new lab and maybe they have an ongoing project, or there's data that a student collected a long time ago that never got published, and they say, here, take this. You have no idea what's there, right? And how one person names their files and organizes their files is very different from how you might conceptually do it, or how the lab might do it, or the lab next door might do it. And so since there's many different ways that we can organize the data, we have multiple files per subject, especially if you've done a lot of functional tasks. It's important to try and come up with a way to organize the data that makes it shareable, so that if, say, I'm collecting monetary incentive delay task in adolescents, and Alan's group is collecting it in adults, maybe one day we say, you know what, let's put this together and look at this cross-sectionally to see if there's changes by age. Well, as long as our sequences are the same and our data is organized the same, it makes it very easy for us to merge that information together, right? Yeah, so it makes it easier to share your data across labs. One of the things about this method that we're going to talk about a bit today, the BIDS, or the Brain Imaging Data Structure method, is it started out as a focus on the raw data. And by raw data, we mean minimally processed. You've taken the DICOM and you've converted it to a nifty file, but you haven't done anything else to it. And so how do we organize that? But we also think about how might we organize some of the DICOM data, as well as any process data, event-related data. If you've gone through the process of applying your regressions, where do we store that? Or if you've done different types of regressions to look at your data differently, how might you store that? BIDS also has available validation tools to make sure that you follow the format that they recommend. And although it's still early on, they're working towards this standard of BIDSifying, if you will, process data. Because if you've used, say, FreeSurfer, they have one way of organizing their output. But then if you use SPM or FSL, they have other methods. And so how do we understand what we're looking at, right? And there's also a growing number of members of the community who are accepting BIDS formatted data. So for example, these are just some of the different websites that have collected data under this BIDS framework. And so you have things like Loris or Coins, which are more data management systems that use BIDS as part of their underlying architecture. You can have tools like XNAT, which is also an open source platform, but it's involved with the management of the data as well as QA, and they use a BIDS framework. Flywheel, which is not only data management in terms of data collection, but also ways of processing the data and trying to standardize how you organize that processed data. And Repronym is also something similar, although they also have on top of that a desire to be able to find and share data across communities. And there's a number of different software packages that are working towards a standard of supporting BIDS. I believe this is predominantly through Docker, which I don't use yet. It's kind of on the list of things to do. But which try and take advantage of how the data has been organized at the beginning so that it makes it a little bit easier to do the processing later on. So it becomes a little bit more plug and play. So you may ask yourself, well, so what? How much does data organization really matter? For those of you who have written fellowships or planning to write fellowships, right now you're not really asked to describe rigor or reproducibility, but you will be. When you get to the level of putting in R01s, you are going to be asked to describe how are you making sure that your data path is rigorous, but also that it is possible for other people to be able to reproduce what you did. And that's part of why bids and these ideas of data uniformity are important, because it establishes a way that we can encourage ourselves towards this reproducibility standard. And so early on, this table here is from one of Russ Poldrak's papers, and he's just talking about processing, and you've been hearing about that throughout the course, and you'll hear a hell of a lot more. But you can see that just at the step of, say, motion correction, there's 4 different ways that you can do this that might be possible. Slice timing, whether you do it or not, how you do it. And all of these different steps over time, you have over 69,000 possibilities of how you can process your data. And I'm not going to know what you did, and you're not going to know what I did unless it's documented somewhere. And that's really what this is all about. And it's important for all of these levels, from the planning level to the implementation level, to how we validate what we've done, to even how we do our data sharing. So I'm just going to give a high-level overview of what is involved with bids. And there's basically 4 different standards that apply to the bids format. The first thing is compulsory, and that's the idea of standardizing things like naming schemes and how we're going to name our files and how we might organize things. There's optional, where these are things that don't have to be included, but if it is included, you should save it in some standard format. So for example, we all are collecting T1 weighted images of some kind. We may or may not be collecting T2 weighted images. If we are, we try and keep the organization similar. Additional files, these are files that are not currently part of their standard. For example, if you're using ePrime to do your stimulus presentation, it spits out EDAT files. They haven't accounted for it per se, but how might we organize those to make it easier to share that information? And finally, the idea of inheritance, the fact that you can have files that exist at any level within your bid structure, and that the values at the upper level are inherited by your lower levels, unless you have to overwrite them. So for example, TR. So if you have something standardized in terms of how you do your data acquisition, you could absolutely put it at the upper level, and the meaning up there kind of propagates down towards the files that are below. And there's really only 3 main types of data files that are used with bids. The first is our friend Nifty, and that is the one which has our imaging data that's been minimally processed. Ideally, you can use a tool called DCM to NICS to do your conversion, but there are certainly other tools that will also work, and there's a reason that DCM to NICS is preferred, and I'll get to that in a moment. There's also tabular files. These tab delimited files are typically used for things like describing your data. So if you have a behavioral task, you would have within your functional directory a tab delimited file that explains all of the events that happened over the time course of that task. It could also explain things like, in this data set, here are some minimal things you need to know about the subjects that I collected, which could be things like their age, the date that the scan happened, or how many visits that person has. Maybe there's certain parameters that are important for analyzing the data, like what their depression rating was at the time of the scan, and that could go in there too. And then finally, there's the metadata file, and these are what we refer to as JSON or sidecar files. And JSON, these are just JavaScript notation files that provide us additional information about the imaging. And so it could be things like the name of your data set, a description of the task that you used, information about the scanner that was used, the parameters that were used, and it's really just a key value pair of, okay, this is TR, and TR is defined as 800 milliseconds, etc. And this is just to show you an example of what a JSON file might look like. In this case, this is a dataset description file, which is one of the required files that you would have in the BIDS format. And you'll see that we have this key value pair where we have a name for our experiment, what version of BIDS we used, because that version is still evolving. Information about who maybe developed the experiment, are there any acknowledgments? You could put pretty much anything in here that you wanted to that was relevant to describing your experiment. But at a minimum, a name and a BIDS version is what's required for this particular file. We also have things like README and changes files, and I'm sure you're familiar with those over time. But the README is basically, just your free-form text file that describes something about your data set in more detail. Your changes file is like your version history. And so it can, in this example, maybe you've started doing a data collection and you initially started it in January, and then you decided that you were going to add pure correction to your T1 weighted and T2 weighted images, and that you wanted to include that in your release. Well, that's something you would document here. Maybe you early on are running your paradigm and find that that you thought it was writing out an event and it really wasn't writing it out to the file. So you made that correction, you might need to document that here, that you've made some sort of adjustment to what's in your data file. And the directory structure is pretty simple. Essentially, the idea is that you have the name of your study, which I think that no one has any question about that. But then we identify our subject with this SUB dash as a prefix, followed by some sort of participant label. So in the early days, there was this implication that it had to be a numeric that would have to be 001, 002, and so on, and that's not true. It could be whatever blind number, or identifier that you would like to use for your subjects. We also have the option of including a session label. So what that means is if you scan someone multiple times over the course of the experiment, you can actually label this as session 1, session 2, and so on to keep those separate. And underneath this, within the study itself, you also have an area where you would store your code, derivatives, so that refers to any process data. So once you have your minimally processed imaging data, the bare bones nifty, and you go through the process of doing motion correction and so on, you would put it in derivatives. If you create a group level statistical map, it goes in derivatives, okay? Stimuli, so that could be if you wanted to include, let's say you're doing a food picture study, you can put pictures in that stimulus directory so that people know what your subject's reviewing. Source data refers actually to the DICOM, and so this is where you would put all of your raw data, keeping it separate from your minimally processed data, kind of as an added layer of protection.
Yes.
Are the DICOMs mandatory? Because I've heard some people say that they only want to share skull strip data because when you include like the image of
So,
the face,
right.
it's like
So for sharing, you don't have to share the DICOM if you
Okay.
don't want to. This is just a suggestion how in your own lab you might organize the data. So for example, I have an R01 that is required to submit data to the archives at NIH. Yeah, not so cool. It's a
Oh.
pain in the butt.
Oh.
But I only share the minimally processed data. I don't give them my DICOM. Other projects like ABCD, after they go through their vetting process of making sure that the data pass their quality assurance, they will include the DICOM as part of their upload in addition to minimally processed and their derived data. So that way anyone who has permission to work with ABCD can choose what they want to do. Do they want to just grab the free surfer volumetric data? Do they want to do processing themselves? So, but it makes it easier for you to say, yeah, I'm just going to share what's in this directory, but you know where that is. It makes it easy to share. The participants file, which I mentioned a little earlier, that just describes the subjects that are participating in the study. The data description file, your README and your changes. Now, underneath each subject, there are subdirectories as well. And they really fall into these main categories. And I'm missing one. Oops, there's 4. So there's your anatomical directory, there's your functional directory. If you collect diffusion weighted images, they have their own directory. And if you collect field maps, which that's what's missing is an FMAP, that's your field map directory. And within them, you have a certain way that you would name your files. And as you see in bold, there's certain things that are mandatory, and that's namely what your subject ID is, what modality the image is, T1 weighted, T2 weighted, flare, proton density, and so on. And then is it NIFTY or JSON, or for example with diffusion you have BVEC and BVAL files that have additional information. In the case of the functional, you also have task, because you want to know if this is a resting state scan, if this is the monetary incentive delay task, the Q learning task, the stop signal task, and so on. And you have these additional parameters that you can include that give more information about the scan, like run index. Maybe you do your task 10 times or resting state 4 times in the course of your study, so you want to keep track of that. Or maybe you collect more than one T1. You can keep track of that too. And so it's actually pretty simple to organize once you get started. Okay, so the easiest thing to do to start working towards creating BIDS compliant data is, as I mentioned, this DICOM to NIX command. And the reason is that DICOM to NIX is nice enough that it will not only create a NIFTY file, but it will also create that JSON file for you that has some of the mandatory key value pairs that you need. And you can even tell DICOM to NIX that you want to name your file a particular way to conform to that standard. So it makes it easy-ish to organize your data. Okay. Yeah, this is just kind of my note to myself, that the format that's used for the compression is this PIGS format, and I don't know enough about it, so I decided I'm not going to do that. I'm going to stick to the tried and true gzip because I know that works. And so I just go ahead afterward and I run gzip on my NIFTY file to compress it to try and save space. One thing that you're going to run into here is on the GE, so DICOM to NIX plays very well with Siemens. And if you're collecting single band or multi-band functional data, it has no problem with doing that conversion and creating the JSON file. It's a little trickier with our GE because for us to do that conversion right now requires the DICOM and the P file. And so Aaron has put together scripts that are more automated for us and automatically create that nifty file for us so that we don't have to do the conversion ourselves. But that misses some of this information, right? It doesn't create the JSON file. So I cheat. So what I do is I run DICOM to Nix on that DICOM file, knowing that some of the parameters are going to be wrong, and then I go back and I correct it. What's wrong? Slice timing. So information about when these slices are corrected. In a single band, if you're collecting 30 or 40 slices, it's very good about telling us when each of these slices happened. But with the multiband on the GE, without that P file, it doesn't know that we're actually collecting, say, 9 slices at once and how they're organized. And so I've subsequently figured out in some of my shell scripts how to do that and how to add that information to the JSON file. But this is still a great start to, so that you don't have to recreate it by yourself by reading the DICOM and so on. Now, since you would be in a position to want to create, like with a new study, creating a JSON file, there are tools for that. There's Joe, which allows you to create a new instance. JQ is another tool which lets you manipulate a JSON file, so you can add fields, subtract fields, change their values, and so on. And those are freely available on GitHub, and they're available on FMRI too. Your labs may vary, but that's something that if you have a sysadmin, you can certainly ask them to install it if it's something that is of interest to you. And if you wanted to, worst case scenario, you can absolutely open up a text editor and manually do it yourself. That's a pain. I'd rather do it this way and just have it scripted in. And this is just an example, which you can kind of read, kind of not read, of a project that we have going on right now where I've written a script that will take the DICOM files and build this bids directory of my minimally processed data for my study. And so you can see that there's, the anatomical and the diffusion. Here are all my field maps. And for the functional, these really don't belong there, but there's an events file that describes all of the different things that my participants would have seen. These 1D files really belong in the derivatives folder. So. And what's nice is that you can also check compliance. There's a website that has bids validator, which if you were to point it at your data, it would tell you whether or not you're following the bid standard. Alternatively, there's an actual program that you can get off GitHub that you can use. Right now, it only runs, from what I've seen, under Chrome and Firefox. So if you're a Safari user, because you like to have your data on a Mac, you're going to have to install one of these other browsers to work with it. But it works really well. I've used it on when I was setting up my experiment to figure out whether my script was working correctly. So that was really helpful. And these are just some additional resources about bids. So the bids neuroimaging IO, that they have all of the documentation, including what software is compliant with the bids format. They used to have a PDF that described the bids method, and they've done away with the PDF, and now it's all online. I think they're working towards having a tool that will automatically take what's online and create a PDF out of it for you. But for now, I find that a little more annoying. I'm still kind of old school, and I like paper sometimes. So I find it a little easier to work on paper because then I can take notes on it. But it's all up there. There's also the reproducibility website at Stanford. What's really nice there is they have a blog, and one of the things on their blog from about a year or so ago is they give 3 different approaches on how you can create bids compliant data sets. And so one of them is doing it manually, one of them is scripting it, and then the last one is using HoodyConv, which is a heuristical DICON converter tool. The downside of HoodyConv is it works really well with the Siemens. We could potentially get it to work with the GE, but it requires some modification on the front end in terms of when you're setting up your experiments, how you name your protocols on the scanner, because it's going to use that information when it creates your files. And then there's bids to NDA. So this is where I said haha about uploading data to NIH. So bids to NDA is this tool that is meant to take your bids formatted data and convert it to what NDA requires for their upload. Because one of the things about NDA is that they have their own identifier called GWID, which is like global something identifier. I forgot what the U stands for. And the rationale behind that is to allow you to kind of tie together different experiments that one person might have done. So they want you to tie that to your data set. Now, I don't use the GWID's ID because it's gobbledygook. It's like this long string of like 12 or 16 letters and numbers, and there's no rhyme or reason. It's easier for me to remember 6185 than it is for me to remember this 16-digit alphanumeric. So the problem with the bids to NDA is that it seems to lag behind the NDA requirement. If you have ever tried to use or modify your data to work with NDA, they have this common delimited file called image03.csv. And it's a template on how you inform NDA what your data looks like, what you're uploading. And that template seems to change every time I have to do a data upload. And bids to NDA is not keeping up with that. So that's the one problem I have with that. It used to work pretty well, and now not so much. And so if you use it, just be mindful of the fact that you still have additional steps that you have to use. The other thing it doesn't do, or at least I haven't tested it recently, is that I have my sub-6185 and I want to convert it to NDA. It's supposed to have a GWID ID. They don't actually rename my file with the GWID ID. They just kind of make this image03 package. And I find that problematic because that's not what I understand the data organization is supposed to be. It's supposed to be by the GWID. So you end up renaming things. So that's my other beef with them. And then the last thing is this reproducibleimaging.org. That's the repronym study, which UCSD is one of the sites, along with MGH, and I forget who else, but I think Stanford may be involved as well. And they're, again, involved with this idea of reproducible imaging and have all these tools available to help you reach that standard. So that's all I have. Are there any questions? Did I go too fast? Was it boring? Probably.
Do you have a sense of like how many labs across the country are using this format?
Off the top of my head, no. Other than that, there are more people engaged with data sharing and this data requirement that NIH now has about uploading your data. So I would imagine that number is growing. And we know that ABCD is using it, for example, and a lot of these people who use Flywheel and some of these other tools are also now using it. So you had a question?
Maybe that answers it, but are there any other competing systems that are sort of to the same extent as large as BIDS, or is BIDS really standalone in terms of the standardized system?
I have not seen anyone else at this. I don't think I've seen any other approaches beyond BIDS for data organization. In fact, one of the things about bids is that because it is a growing tool, some of the things you didn't hear me talk about are MEG, EEG. That's because those standards are under development for bids, and you can actually become part of the community if you feel that you want to contribute to how that data is standardized. But so that's their ultimate goal, is to kind of branch across multiple modalities. Yeah. Any other questions?